Thank you, Craig. So a lot of the material didn't go out. So for some of you, you didn't receive any material because of this mix-up, but you will get it after the fact. Craig is going to take down your names, and Noemi will make sure you get the material. This is a class I've never taught before. It was an idea that I had to teach the different eras of Jewish history through lesser known characters. Some of you actually may recognize some of the people. I don't think, unless I'm mistaken, you won't recognize all of them. I've worked at, of the 12, 6 of them are men and 6 are women. That alone was a challenge because in our traditional histories, we have not featured women. It's been by and large a great men's view of history. So I'm going to be, tonight we're going to look at the Torah era, the era of the Torah itself. And then we're going to go into the period after the Torah, which is the early period of the settlement of the land of Canaan, the period of the judges leading into the kingship period. Then we're going to look at the later kingship period and the end of the kingship period, the beginning of the diaspora. So each of these will begin with a story of a character in our history that will define one aspect of the era. We can't possibly cover 4,000 years of history in 12 one-hour sessions, but it will be an introductory kind of approach toward a theme that perhaps we haven't dealt with before. And you'll see today that we're doing Torah, and many of you study Torah with us over the years and continue to, but we're going to be looking at it in a little different way. And we're going to do it through the eyes of Tamar. And we'll talk a little about Tamar and her story and what it may teach us about that historical period and the way it was seen. So I titled it The Murdered, Martyred, and Misunderstood, because many of these characters, these individuals, either faded into history or are not really clearly well understood, or were not embraced. And so we're gonna look and shine a light on them. So at the very least, you're gonna meet some new people among our family, and maybe have a few insights that are different than what you've thought about different eras. So to begin, because I chose Tamar to begin, Tamar is a woman in the Bible, a very important woman. I don't know if her name means anything to you other than it means a date palm. Tamar is a date palm. You may know Tam Nixon or someone named Tamara, and that all comes from there, Tamar. If you go to Israel, the Tamar are those beautiful date palms you see everywhere, in particularly the Dead Sea area and Jordan Valley. So we're going to look at her, and she's a pivotal figure in the history of the Jewish people. But to understand a little about it, I've been doing a lot of studying and reading through the lenses of modern women's Jewish scholars, because most of my education has been through male Jewish scholars and male commentators and male writers, because that by and large has been the way Judaism has been approached through men. But in the last 30 or more years, some remarkable women have been doing some creative writing and a lot of important scholarship. There's a book that was just published in English this summer. It was published in Hebrew in 2009, and a second volume came out I believe 2013, of modern women writing midrash in classical midrash form. By the way, for those who do Torah study, this is a teaser, but I happen to be teaching the Torah classes on Shabbat morning the first 2 weeks of November, and I'm going to be choosing women's midrash from these books as a way of teaching Bereshit, because we're in the Bereshit portions, and I want to feature these midrashim to show you the lens of what these women have created through a few midrashim that they've created. So the book is called Dir Shuni, D-I-R-S-H-U-N-I, Dir Shuni. It's in English. It's not inexpensive. It's like $30 or more on Amazon. And the Hebrew is inaccessible to to all of you, I would think. The Midrash is there, and then there's a commentary right after it, which explains the Midrash in detail and the understanding of how the author came to it. So we're going to start with one of those passages. During the High Holy Day period, we are saying the prayer for Tal, for dew, during the prayer service. And then at the end of the high holiday season, the end of Sukkot, we switch over to Geshem, to rain. And there's a prayer for rain at Shmini Atzeret at the end. And now for the rest of winter, we're going to say the prayer for rain. So this is the Midrash that was written based on a poem that is said in traditional synagogues, only featuring men's names, biblical men's names. This was written with biblical women's names, just to take a glance at some of the women that we are familiar with and look at the water and the way it relates to them. So, Craig, if you would share the first one. So this is written, this is Jewish history through the lens of little known figures, and this is the prayer. It would normally be our God and God of our patriarchs, and the original poem is all about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and others. But this has been written by a woman in the last 10 years from the standpoint of 6 Jewish women of importance. So, Bobby, would you be our first reader, please?
I would be happy to.
Thank you.
Okay. Our God and God of our matriarchs, remember the mother, anointed in Holy Spirit like water, whose laughter rolled like streams of water, whose woman's way you resumed, blood flowing like water. The babes of kingdoms she suckled, milk as abundant as water. For her sake, do not hold back water. Remember the one who went out.
Bobby, wait 1 second.
Okay.
So for her sake, do not hold back water. Who are we talking about in that first paragraph?
That Miriam?
No, remember the mother who laughed and who resumed being capable to be a mother in old age? Sarah. So the first one reflects Sarah and talks about her flowing and her milk, because the Midrash says that she went, in order to prove the baby was hers at 90 years old, her breasts poured forth milk and she suckled other babies as well as Isaac. So that was Sarah. Okay, so let's go on to remember the second one.
Remember the one who went out in the evening to draw well water. Kindness flowed from her jar like water. When she heard the servant ask for a little water, she hurried, drawing until all camels finished drinking water.
Greg, you're going to have to move it, please. Thank you.
For her righteousness grant abundant water.
Okay, so who is that second person?
Rebecca. Is that Rebecca?
Yes, Rebecca, right. Rebecca, who met Eliezer, Abraham's servant, right, with his camels, and she poured water not only for him, but for all 10 of the camels. Her kindness was why Eliezer knew that she was the bride for Isaac. Okay, so we go to the third.
Remember the shepherdess who came with her flock to the well of water, wailing and bitter crying. She weeps for her children like water, whose sister's eyes were tender from tears of water. Her womb you opened like a river of water. For their sake, do not withhold water.
Okay, so who are these two women? One woman, remember the shepherdess, and remember that she cries for her children, and her sister's eyes were tender with tears of water. So who do you think those two are?
Rachel and Leah?
And Leah.
Right, Rachel and Leah, the sisters, right? Leah, whose eyes were dim and who gave forth 6 children plus Dinah, 6 boys and Dinah, and Rachel, who allowed her sister to marry Jacob before her. So we have the 2 women there. So now we go to the next.
Remember the one who stood by the reeds, watching by the Nile's water. She breathes life into newborns, saving them from death-dark water. Who, with her drum and circle dance, sang at the sea of water. By her merit, you bore them the gift of rolling well of water. For her righteousness, grant abundant water.
So we know who that is, right? Who was
Miriam.
that? Yes, Miriam. She watched by the reeds as Moses was in his basket, right? And she danced and sang at the sea as the women dancing with their timbrels, right? Okay. And now the last one is more difficult. There are 2 women mentioned here. And let's go to the final one here.
Remember she who sat under a palm tree in the hills of Ephraim. In her song, the earth quaked. Also the clouds dripped water. The stars in their orbits waged war from skies bearing water. And she, most blessed of women, who gave milk instead of water. For their sake, do not withhold water.
So this is hard. This goes outside the Torah into the period of the Judges. So did anyone have a guess on this one? Thank you.
One would be Deborah.
Yes, Deborah is the one who sat by the palm tree and who helped win the war. And who is the most blessed of women who gave milk instead of water? That's a tough one. She also used a tent peg.
Oh, Yael.
Yael.
Yeah.
Thank you, Craig. You can unshare now. So Yael, because Yael, at the end of the Deborah story, Yael kills Sisera, who is the general who's fleeing away from the forces that Barak and Deborah defeated, and Yael kills him. And that is the end of that period. So Yael is considered a great warrior as well. So there you have a woman's reading, right? This woman's reading of a midrash poem in order to celebrate the women in our tradition, and whereas the normal prayer is only celebrating the men and water. So I chose Tamar in order to celebrate the women in the Torah. But more than that, I said that she's one of the most important links in our tradition. How many of you know the story of Tamar and Judah?
Yeah.
Joni and Bobby, remember it? Sissy,
Yeah.
you know it? It is the core story that brings us King David and the Messiah. Without Tamar, we don't get to David. We don't get to the Messiah. We don't get any of that line, none of it. She is the link. It's amazing. And it is her actions that make it happen. Even though it's Judah, that's the 4th son of of Jacob and Leah, and Judah will be the dominant tribe in the land of the south, which becomes the Judahites, the Jews. We are named after Judah, the Yehudim, the Judahites. That's our name, Jews, right? The ones who thank God. Yehuda comes from Modeh, thank you. Modim anachnu lach. We thank you, God. So Tamar, though, is the one who makes it happen, not Judah. So now we're going to read her story. And this comes from Sepharia, chapter 38 in the book of Genesis. So Craig, if you could bring that one up. Now this in Sepharia, as you know, could be in Hebrew and English. So this one has both links in it. You can also, when you go on Sepharia, just do it in English or just in Hebrew. So let me read the story this time, and I'll take you through. And Craig, we're going to be going somewhat quickly, okay? So about the time Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira, there Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua, and he took her into his household as wife and cohabited with her. So Judah gets married. That's what that said, right? She conceived and bore a son. His name was So they have a firstborn. She conceived again and bore a son. His name was Onan. They have a second son. Once again, she bore a son and named him Shelah. He was at Chazib when she bore him. That's the third son, right? Onan, and Shelah. Okay. Judah got a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar, right? That's our girl. That's our woman. So she's married to Judah's firstborn, But Judah's firstborn, was displeasing to Adonai, and Adonai took his life. I don't want to go into that. There's a lot of midrash on what happened there. But so is dead. And Judah said to Onan, that's number 2, second son, join with your brother's wife and do your duty. Because there's a tradition, as many of you know, in the Bible, that if a firstborn dies without a child, a son, his wife must marry a brother and have a child in name, the firstborn's name. So Onan is duty bound to marry Tamar. Now, do your duty by her as a brother-in-law, provide offspring for your brother. But Onan, knowing that the offspring would not count as his, let his semen go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring to his brother. Right? Coitus interruptus is born right there. Now, what happens is, by the way, that's interpreted traditionally in the Catholic Church and in some parts of Judaism as masturbation. It isn't masturbation, but it's interpreted that way. But let's go on. I divert. So let's digress. So let's stay on. So is dead. Onan won't impregnate her for whatever selfish reason he has. What he did was displeasing to Adonai, so he took his life also. So Onan is dead. Judah's got 3 sons. He's got 1 left. And he sees Tamar as a black widow. Right? She's killed 2 of his sons in his eyes. She's bad luck at the very least. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought he too might die like his brother. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So Tamar goes home because Shelah is a young man, not yet of marrying age, apparently. And Judah is trying to delay this, even though he knows he has to join Tamar with Shelah. He doesn't want to do it. So he's looking for a way to postpone it at the least. A long time afterward, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. So Judah is now a widower. When his period of mourning was over, Judah went to Timnah with his sheep shearers, together with his friend Hira the Adulamite. So Judah goes off to shear sheep. You know what that means in Jewish terms? Going off to brand the cattle and be around the campfire. And who hangs around campfires traditionally? Campfire ladies sing this song. There's usually some women hanging around men's campfires in case the men get interested in women. And he's a widower. So Tamar was told, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing. She, realizing that Judah is delaying her marrying his youngest son, she took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, and wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as wife. When Judah saw her, he took her for a harlot, for she had covered her face, meaning she dressed herself up in whatever the traditional dresses were for prostitutes in that area. And she was covered up. So you have to think about the veils, the hijabs in Iran. She was covered up. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, here, let me sleep with you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. What, she asked, will you pay for sleeping with me? He replied, I'll send a kid from my flock. You know, the check's in the mail. And she said, you must leave a pledge until you sent it. How can I trust you? I don't know you. He said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your seal and cord and the staff which you carry. Now, all of those had identifying marks on them that identified those as belonging to Judah. His seal, his cord, and his staff were all inscribed to him. So he gave them to her and slept with her. And of course, she conceived by him. She became pregnant. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb. Let's scroll down. Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he couldn't find her. He inquired of the council of the locale, where is the prostitute, the one at A9 by the road? And they said, there's been no prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I couldn't find her. Moreover, the local council said there'd been no prostitute here. So Judah said, let her keep him, lest we become a laughing stock. I did send her this kid, but you didn't find her. So almost 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she's pregnant from harlotry. Bring her out, said Judah, for she should be burned. You see, now he's got a way to get rid of this woman, right? Because he doesn't know it's his. And he figures, now I don't have to give Shelah to her, because that way Shelah can marry a woman that doesn't kill off my sons. As she was brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. It's by the man to whom these belong that I'm pregnant. And she added, examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these? Judah recognized them and said, she is more in the right than I am, inasmuch as I did give her to my son Shelah, not give her to my son Shelah, and he was not intimate with her again. And the time came forth to give birth, and there were twins in her womb. And while she was in labor, one of them put out a hand, and the midwife tied a crimson thread on that hand to signify the one came out first. And just then it drew back its hand, and out came its brother, and she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he was named Peretz. Afterward, his brother came out, on whose hand was the crimson thread. He was named Zerah. Okay, thank you, Craig. Quite a story, huh? So you know now this story's in the Bible. It's right there in Genesis chapter 38. It's got a lot of juicy stuff in it. But for our purposes, a father-in-law and daughter-in-law had sex. They produced 2 children. One of them is Peretz. Peretz is the great-great-grandfather of King David, by Tamar and Judah. And it's Tamar that makes it happen, right? Judah is preventing her from conceiving in the genetic line that will become the Davidic line. It's through Judah, and it would have been through Shelah, but it's through Judah and Tamar. So you think about Tamar in the sense of understanding women in the Torah period, that is the pre-state period, before we get to the promised land. Tamar is part of the Genesis story, part of the founding families. What are her options in life as a woman, biblically? What power does she have? That's a real question. Any of you can answer an answer. You just have to unmute.
How is the body, her body, the sex?
Well, she has her body and her looks. That's true. She has that.
Yeah. She's also very clever.
She has to use her wits, right? She has to use her mind to figure out how to best make the system work for her.
And this is before, like, the daughters of Zelophehad, right? So she would have no way to inherit from her father.
Right. She, as Joni said, she doesn't have inheritance rights. That's much, much later in the, that's during Moses. That's already coming up in the future. So she has no inheritance rights. She doesn't get from her father. She doesn't get from any of the boys, the 2 boys that died, right? So she is powerless, except for how she can make the system protect her and work for her interests. Now, our tradition looks very favorably on Tamar and says she, in her wisdom, knew that her line would produce kings. And she knew that her mitzvah was to get pregnant by the Judah line. And if Judah would not fulfill his obligation, she would make him, if by deception, then by deception. And if you think of the women in the Torah, who else used different deceptions in order to fulfill what they believed, and in fact, what they ended up being right about, they needed to do? Who of the matriarchs, who of those, who?
Leah.
Leah, how did she do that?
She managed to wed Jacob before her sister.
Right. So she and her sister deceived Jacob in order that she could marry him, and through her came, among others, Judah. Right? So through that deception of 2 women, 2 sisters, who had to find a way in order to make what had to happen occur, they had to use their wits and their own abilities to make that happen. That's true. Who else? Anyone else?
Rebecca, when she had Esau dress up as if he were
Jacob, right? Jacob dress up as Esau, right?
Yeah, sorry.
No, right. Rebecca also has to outmaneuver Isaac, who thinks that the blessing should go to Esau, because Esau is a man's man, right? And Jacob was a tent dweller. And, he liked to hang around the tent and cook with his mother, but Esau was out there hunting. And so Isaac favored Esau. But Rebecca knew that it was Jacob that needed to carry the line on. And how was she going to show that to Isaac? Well, she had to deceive him. So she cooked up this Halloween plan. It's a very appropriate time of year. Dressed him up as Esau character, cooked the stew up, and convinced Isaac to give the blessing to Jacob. So here we go back. We now have the deception of Rebekah with Isaac and Judah and Jacob. Then we have Rachel and Leah deceiving Jacob in order to marry Leah and not just Rachel, so that Judah will be born, along with Levi and Shimon and Reuben and the others, and Dinah. And now we have Tamar, who deceives Judah in order to produce the line that will eventually go to David. And by the way, that line goes through two other women. Post-Torah, two other very important women will be connected to David. Can you guess who those two women are? One, we just read her story at Shavuot. Right, Joni knows. Ruth. Ruth will be the great-grandmother of David, and Ruth will marry a Judahite, Boaz. Boaz comes from the line of Tamar. And the other one, I don't think you'll guess. It takes us back to the story of Jericho. Who was the woman in Jericho that was a key figure to the conquering of the city of Jericho? I don't know if you remember her. It's not a name that most people know. It starts with an R, that's right. Rahab. Rahab is the, wait, I don't know how do we put, she is the manager of a hostel in Jericho, a procurer of flesh, shall we say, who puts up the two spies that Joshua sends and makes them pledge that when they conquer the city, they will save her and her family. Rahab, according to our tradition, marries a Judahite, and out of them comes Boaz. And Boaz marries Ruth, and out of Ruth comes David. Now think of that, of the power of these clever women who have no power, no physical power, no political power, no economic power. They have no rights legally. They are, not only are they owned in effect by their husbands and their fathers, they have no choice in who to marry. And yet, because of them, the entire line of leadership, of political leadership of our people, and one could argue the future redemptive leadership, comes out of them. And these, you could even argue the men were kind of stupid. They're the ones that get deceived over all of them. In every generation, we got another guy who gets deceived in order to be used by God through these women, if you think theologically, in order to produce David and Solomon and the line of the Mashiach. What do you think about that?
I'm going to say that it just appears, and I'm not too knowledgeable about this, but it appears that the men become very weak when it comes to the women and what they offer. I'll use the word because I can't think of a better word, offering sex. They just, the men don't think as well.
How interesting.
They're only thinking with
Okay.
one body part.
I'm going to put me back on mute now.
Now you know what I have to go through, right?
Okay. Anyway.
Well, they're also sort of a victim of their time, because since the women's only value is, the commodity of their sexuality, they've got to be thinking of the women not as like intellectual equals, or it doesn't sound in any way like they were, co-leaders of the family or anything like that. So they're just not used to thinking about women as being smarter than them or as smart as them, or people who would exploit their whatever power they do have to get what they want.
Good, right? Yes, Sissy.
However, what I see here is that all these women did, to me, like they were obeying a command, a mandate, or maybe they were chosen to do that by God, or because it's interesting, but they didn't have any rights. However, through having their babies, they in this unique way become so important in life, actually, and not just in our life as Jew people, but the whole world, because through this woman and their decision, I believe that I can just start thinking that they were listening to a voice telling them, you have to do this, because through this is what we are. You are the chosen one, because I need you to do this, because I'm going to bring my people. That's what I actually come to me.
Good. No, and our tradition understands it that way, that because our tradition is a theological tradition, it understands that they are listening to that voice of God. And we would say they're listening to the Shekhinah, because that's the feminine voice of God that speaks. Yeah.
And it's so important to see that, and I don't want to be controversial here, like feminism or not, it's the power of motherhood at the end. It's like through our kids, we bring our children to the world, and all of them has a wonderful future. And we have to always protect them, because one of them is going to be maybe the next king, and we have to always protect them. It's very interesting.
You also bring up something that's important. Remember, they don't just bear these children.
Yeah.
They raise these children.
They raise these children, yeah.
Each one of these children is not, the father will have an influence, but they are nurtured, they are breastfed, they are taught by their mothers. These women, Tamar, even though she doesn't ever have another child that we know of, she will raise up parrots, and parrots will become whatever the man is. And all of these people that are produced ultimately are nurtured by the mothers, these same women. Jacob is nurtured by Rebecca. She is the major factor in his life that shapes him. And Rachel and Leah will each be important factors. Rachel in Joseph. Rachel, nurtures Joseph. She doesn't nurture Benjamin because she dies in childbirth. But Leah nurtures her sons as they're growing up. So they don't have political power, they don't have military power, they don't have economic power, they don't have legal rights, but they do have the power to shape the future
motherhood
in their own area. It's a very narrow area. It is narrow by today's standards. But what they use is what they have available, and they use it in a way to shape actually our tradition,
our history.
And what you know about Christianity, think about that as well. Who is seen by Catholicism as the prime mover with Jesus? It's Mary. It's his mother, right? It's not Joseph. it's his mother, right? Because it's Mary and God, according to their tradition, but it's Mary who will nurture him. So in a real sense, you know, if you think about the Torah, even though the stories are all told from men's standpoint, and they tend to revolve around the patriarchs, all in the underneath this scene, the ones who are making things happen, think of Moses. Think of the women in Moses's life. Think of those deceptions. Let's talk about Moses for a minute. How many women were involved in deceptions with Moses? Right? So let's start the story. There were the nursemaids, Pua and Shifra, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have to deceive Pharaoh in order to allow for the births of the sons that they were supposed to kill off. There's before Miriam, there's Yocheved. Yocheved has to bear the child and hide the child, and then deceive everyone around and put him in a basket in order to find a way to make him live. There's Miriam, who hides herself and watches and follows. And then there's the daughter of Pharaoh, who has to somehow convince the court and Pharaoh to let her raise this foundling, right? Then there's, I mean, if we go further, there's Tzipporah. There'll be another moment when Tzipporah saves Moses's life by circumcising her sons because he neglected to do it, right? I mean, there's all these stories of women that are surrounding Moses. And yet when we tell the story, they are not featured, they are supporting cast. And that's kind of the way I want us to think about Torah, that instead of just thinking about it as the starring cast, because the cast is starring the men, because it was written by men from a men's standpoint in a world where men had all the power, the physical, political, economic, legal, all of that revolved around men. And yet, when the stories are told in our tradition, if we think about the way women are depicted, they're actually shown as much more important, even in many ways, than the men. They are hidden because the men wrote it. And it's sort of like, if you think about a play like Hamlet. Let's take a play, I think most of us know Hamlet. The women behind the scene are secondary characters, right? It stars Hamlet. It's called Hamlet. It stars Hamlet. It's about his father who was killed by his uncle. So it's a lot of male stuff. But behind the scenes, there are women, but they are not prime actors in Hamlet. When Shakespeare tells the story, his women are not the prime actors. But when we tell the Torah story, if we think about the stories, the women are far more important in many ways than the men on these critical junctures of what will produce what becomes Judaism and the Jewish people. So when the story was created, and it was created by men almost exclusively, there are some theories that there might have been women writing in the Torah, but that's unproven. Most scholars believe it was written by men, and most scholars believe it was written at a later date, under later kings of Israel. But whether it was or not, they cast the women in critical roles. They could have erased the women, right? They had the power because they were writing it. They could have erased these women. They could have not told the deception stories.
Maybe
Yes.
not, though.
Okay.
Well, it's basically the story of a huge dynasty, right? It's a family. It's the story of our family. It includes wars, and it includes, all kinds of, as the Torah turns and all that. but it's essentially the story of families. And as you just pointed out, these men who wrote these stories were very much raised by women. So if they're writing a family story, that is going to be part of their worldview, I guess. Although, you know, from the point of view of the, you know, the husband and the wife, if she doesn't have, I don't know. It's the different perspectives, I guess, in different settings. But in this setting, it's really like a family history.
Rabbi, if they were to leave out the women, there'd be a big void actually in the story itself, because you can't be without. And the second thing is, I guess it's true even through today, a supporting cast is as important as the star. They're the ones that help make it, and that goes on whether it's in any kind of relationship whatsoever, I think.
Right,
anyway.
but think about if you're telling the story, for instance, in Egyptian tradition, ancient Egypt, they never report on any of their documents that Pharaoh lost any battles. That all of their documents report only victories. Historically, we know they lost because we have documents from the Assyrians, from other peoples in the Middle East who defeated them. And we know historically they were defeated because we can dig up the cities and we see there were battles and they lost. But they don't report it that way. They report it as only victories.
But
so
ours are nice Jewish boys. Their moms raised them.
The nice Jewish boys have to tell about their moms because they love their moms. Right. But we also tell in the Torah about our blemishes. I mean, think about the stories I just related. She dresses up as a prostitute. This is not just deception. Judah hires a prostitute. We report that Judah did that. I mean, that's not a beautiful kind of beginning to Jewish tradition. Could have tried to dress that up a little, maybe found another way to tell that story. And not just that, but the same is true as we go through the story with Rahab, right? With Rahab having a brothel. Really? Did she, wasn't there another way to kind of tell that story a little bit? Think about this. Rachel and Leah both marry the same man, right? Jacob. Do you know that in our legal tradition of the Torah, it is considered that a child of someone who marries his sister, the sister of his wife, that child is a mamzer. That means all of the children of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah are halachically mamzerim. That's all of us. Now, you can argue, but that was before the law was given, right? The law doesn't take place until after Sinai. And Jacob, Rachel, and Leah are before. However, the rabbis like to say the matriarchs and patriarchs lived by the Torah. They knew the Torah and lived by it even before it was given. So there are a little bit of, there's some legal problems in this thing. And they might have been able to clear that up if they wanted to. But it didn't bother the ones who wrote this story down. They weren't trying to clean it up. They weren't trying to put on their best face. They weren't trying to say we are a pure people who come from only pure people. They were trying, as Jean said, to tell the story of our family as they received it, right? As they themselves heard it and as they appreciated it. Because whatever the schmutz was, it was our schmutz, and it brought us to who we are. and it was nobody else's. And we own that, and we celebrate it. And we find in that lessons about life, because that becomes an important aspect to where we're going to go next. The Torah period is understood by later rabbinic tradition, and we'll get to that, as being there to teach us about our life. Not just the laws, but the lessons of morality and ethics, the lessons of making mistakes, finding ways to atone for them, that the Torah gives us that framework and those stories that will help us to nurture ourselves and our children in our own lives. Now, we're going to leave the Torah and move to the next era. And the next era is a much more vicious, difficult era. It is a transition between the biblical Torahitic period, which really encapsulates the way we love to tell our story. And there's an in-between period that really takes us toward the diaspora, that's going to tell a somewhat different story about our people, and is going to still, it conveys some truths, but not in the same way and not be understood in the same way. And again, we're not telling history here. We're telling family stories. It's not science. It's not history as we understand it, right? This is not history the way we understand it. The Torah doesn't teach us things that history would teach us. For instance, the Torah doesn't tell us who the Pharaoh was that enslaved the people. If an historian was writing it, they would identify that Pharaoh. They would identify the era. They would identify the culture. They would identify what the tribes were around them, what the wars were, what was going on. That's not what the Torah is trying to do. The Torah doesn't tell us about the lives of the historical period. It isn't interested in what Abraham did between the time he was born and the time he heard the cry to God, from God to go, right? The Midrash will later, but the Torah is not interested in that. It's interested in shaping stories that will convey our history from a family standpoint, that will help us live our lives and teach our children how to best live their lives. Right? So remember Tamar. That's a name that you should always remember. You may not remember Rahab tomorrow. You may have to review her story. Her story is less famous, but also a key story. And we will get to Ruth in a different way. But our next is an unknown woman. That's going to be next week. She's only known as the daughter of her father, Yiftach, someone you probably don't know either. She's the daughter of Yiftach. She does have a name in the Midrash, and that's why I put her in the list. And we'll talk a little about her. Her name is Ada. At least that's what the Midrash gives her. The Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible doesn't give her a name. And the modern women who are writing Midrash give her a new name, a different name. And we'll talk about that as well, about how they derive her name and how they give it to her. We're going to look at her name, but we're going to look at her, the daughter of Yiftach, during the Judges period. Now, for those of you on the call, Craig, did you get their names? Were you able to get everybody's names here?
Yes, Rabbi, not a problem.
And if you would get them to Noemi, because I'm going to give her, she'll then send out, because there's a big essay at the end of this material that we weren't going to get to, that I would love you to read about women in the Bible. It's got a lot of wonderful stuff, and maybe some questions will arise from it. And then I'll have her send out next week some readings about that will relate to the judges period and to the daughter of Yiftach. And then we can focus on that period. Any questions, anything that occurs to you or anything you want to say? Yes, Sissy and then Charles. Go ahead.
I just want to say that your class, it can be very inspiring for single mothers.
Oh, I'm glad.
Definitely. It's something that every single mother should listen to this, because, you know, it's like it's actually repositioning us in the way we have to see as us making decisions and how we raise our kids. And I hope that every single mother would hear this. It was very empowering.
Thank you. Charles?
You know, the word you just mentioned, and it's sort of, I've been thinking about, you said the word family. You know, this is the story of our family, meaning the Jewish people. And, you know, I was thinking in a fundamental way, what's the difference fundamentally between a man and a woman? And one of the differences may be that while, and I can only speak obviously from one perspective, but, you know, men, we tend to think, and maybe it goes back to the cave period, we were the hunters. We had to accomplish things. We had to fight. We had to bring in the food. We had to do all that. And women, you know, because of the fact that they have the beauty of birthing and being a child rearing. So family to a woman, I think, has a different resonance than it does with men. Even though we, you know, obviously all of us as men would say, well, we love our family and we're into our family equally. Most men, and I'll speak personally, you know, we have our when we wake up every morning, we're thinking, what are we going to accomplish today, this year, this in our lifetime, right? Women, they think that too, but I think their first priority many times, and women, you can correct me, who are on the call, would say they're really putting at a very high level the perpetuation of the family, the raising of the children, maybe even more than men. So I think when you think of Tamara and the other figures you mentioned and all the deceptions, you know, my first reaction was the word deception is not a very good Jewish word because, you know, we're a very ethical people. So deception is unethical, right? By definition. So that can't be Jewish. But if you think that the core of Judaism is our family and our perpetuation of our people, and, you know, I think that's, you know, I think that's sort of an interesting way of looking at it, why the deception was okay in our tradition, because the men were just too busy. Esau was too busy hunting, and the other men were too busy, you know, giving the blessing. You know, Jacob wanted to give the blessing, and he just had his objectives. But the women were sitting at home at night saying, gee, what's best for our family? And maybe that's why, you know, all these wonderful stories of women and the importance of the women in our tradition is so great.
Right. Well, I think all of those questions and all of those ways of thinking are wonderful, but I'll end with this question. And I'm not asking you to answer it, but to think about it. So if Tamar was so important in the lineage of our tradition, why is she so unknown? Why do so few people know chapter 38 of Genesis and what that link means to our line as a people? So I'll leave you with that, and I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week with the daughter of Yiftach.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks
Shabbat
a lot.
shalom,
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
Greg.
Bye.